You're listening to Idea Collider, a show that explores the world of asymmetric learning. On this show, I will sit down with pharmaceutical experts and business leaders to discuss how to embrace uncertainty and the different learning style that follows. I'm your host, Mike Rea. Let's get into the show. So, Annie Duke, welcome back to Idea Collider. I think you are the first return guest, but mostly because you wrote another book. So I'd love to.
Mostly because I wrote another book, right? I seem to have a habit of that. I don't know.
Yeah. On the subject of which, could you tell us, what motivated you to write a book about quitting as opposed to, the bets that tend to lead to decision making?
Oh, well, first of all, quitting is a bet in itself. So here's the problem that we have, right? Like the point of thinking in bets in terms of the bets that we make in decision making is that we're making these decisions under uncertainty. So we're having to figure out, given that we know very little in comparison to all there is to be known for most things about which we're deciding, and given that luck is going to have an influence on the way that our decisions work out. So really it's because look, quitting is a bet also. Let's just be clear about that. But what's interesting about that particular decision that we might make, which is to exercise the option to quit, is that it's a way to help us with this problem of the original bet that we make, which is a bet about what to start, right? So if we think about all decisions as bets, what that means is that when I'm talking about that, what I'm saying is that we make decisions under conditions of uncertainty. So given that we make decisions when, for most things that we decide, we know very little in comparison to all there is to be known, and given that the outcome of our decisions is going to be very strongly influenced by luck for most things, we have to make some sort of decision under those conditions about how we're going to allocate our resources, right? What options are we going to choose? Knowing that the outcome of those options are going to be probabilistic, right? So we're trying to make some sort of forecast about what might happen in the future. And what we recognize under those circumstances is that after we start something, after we make a decision, we exercise an option, that we are going to discover new stuff afterwards. And the stuff we're going to discover is going to be either new information that we didn't have at the time. It might also just be like, how is luck influencing the outcome of the decision, right? So we're going to find all of that stuff out. And some of that stuff is going to be good news. Some of it's going to be bad news. But we certainly all had that feeling of, I wish I knew then what I know now. Like whether it's like, ooh, I wish I knew that Apple was going to be such a big company, I would have invested in them. Or in the reverse, right? I wish I knew that FTX was going to explode because maybe I would have done different things. For me, it would have been, instead of just not being in crypto, maybe I would have shorted it, right? But I wish that I had known that, right? But for somebody who has invested in crypto or put their money on FTX, clearly they wish they would have known a lot of the information that's come out since then, but they didn't know that. Right? Like they didn't know that, they didn't have access to it. They made the best bet that they could. Now, this is where quitting comes into the equation, which is when you do find out this information, you can quit. You can change what you're doing and do something different, right? Quitting just meaning stopping whatever you've started. But the rub is that quitting itself is also a decision made under uncertainty. So when we decide to quit, we're not going to necessarily know for sure that things aren't going to work out. It's going to be when the probability is high enough, we're exposed to the downside risk enough in our opinion that we ought to stop what we're doing. And there's always some possibility, right? Like if we keep going, we could turn it around, at least for most things that we're doing. So we're also making a bet there. And that bet is that I could continue with the option that I've currently exercised, or I could stop and I could switch to some other option that I might want to explore. And you're making a bet about which thing is going to be better. And just as the decision to start things is very difficult because of uncertainty, so is the decision to stop things. So the reason why I wanted to write this book, honestly, is because Quitting is a very, very valuable skill. It's really important for dealing with uncertainty, yet we're quite bad at exercising the option to quit. And I felt really strongly that people should understand this is a really, really valuable option. And someone needed to have a conversation with grit to say that, look, it's not just sticking to things that's good to do. Like quitting things is really good to do also, particularly under the conditions under which we have to start most things.
Yeah, which is great, because I've used, your analogy or your metaphor with kind of poker playing, right? That the early rounds are not gambling, you're paying to find out. And I think that in the presence of new information, you should make different decisions. And but as you say, this is a sort of this sits against what most people think of as persistence or grit, which has had a lot of traction in the last couple of years. So could you kind of elaborate on the difference between what you see as grit and what you see as kind of as willingness to quit?
So here's the thing. I think that most people think of these as like oppositional. And, as we think about grit versus quit, it's true. Like grit is clearly considered to be virtuous, whereas quitting is for losers, right? Like, I mean, look, winners never quit, quitters never win, right? What does that mean? If I call you a quitter, I must be calling you a loser. The people who stick to it are definitely the heroes of our story. And we have, kind of in this popular culture, and I think particularly in America, this idea that like persistence at all costs is builds character. Just stick to it and you'll succeed. But in reality, grit and quit have to live together. Like the opposite of a great virtue is also a great virtue. That persisting at something when it is worthwhile to do so is definitely a good character trait. But persisting at something when it is no longer worthwhile to do so is not a good character trait. That is when you want to quit. And in reality, these are the exact same decision, right? Like I'm doing something, and at any moment, it's like, should I stick or should I not? Like, should I stay or should I go? And so what we're trying to do is find a calibration between when we should stick and when we shouldn't. And the way that we calibrate is around this notion of worthwhile, right? So essentially, like, this is what we're trying to do in our life, right? We're trying to sample a bunch of stuff. And then the stuff that's worthwhile, we should stick to. And then we should literally quit all the rest. And here's the thing that I want to make clear to people, for people who've read Angela Duckworth's book, Grit, is that she agrees with this, right? So her point is, just because something's hard doesn't mean that you should quit it. And I agree, right? Like you have to be able to stick to hard things in order to find success in life. That's true. But nowhere does she say that you should stick to things that aren't worthwhile.
Right.
Nowhere. Yeah. And yet what people take from that and sort of in the popular culture is like, I never quit things. We think about people as like tough, and we admire them for their stick-to-itiveness. And what we forget about is the worthwhile part. But is what they're sticking to worthwhile? And I think that that's the big question, And so what can be an amazing character trait in one circumstance can turn into a really bad trait to have in another circumstance.
Yeah. And I really like, you certainly reintroduced me to some of the mountain climbing movies that we've seen recently with the kind of hidden story. Maybe you said something like 8 times more people die coming down from Everest than going up. Can you tell us the Everest story first, and then maybe we'll get to the free solo story?
Yeah. So there's a few mountain climbing. I think at some point, by the time I get around to the third one, I'm like, just bear with me because this one's really good. Exactly. And we can talk about the third one if you want, because it is really good. Yeah. So here's the thing, right? So it's like not just that we think of grit as such a great quality, but it's also the persisters are the ones who become the protagonists, right? Like the heroes of our story. even if they're persisting when they ought not to. I mean, this is what I think is kind of interesting. And quitters are either like the cowards of our, like you turn tail, they're weak-willed, they're capricious, so on and so forth. Or sometimes like you just don't even see them. And so, as we think about like what are we sort of ingraining in people in terms of what they're supposed to do? Well, like if the persisters are the heroes of our story, no matter what, and we don't really see the quitters or we view them as cowards, then like what kind of lessons are we going to take from that about whether we should be exercising the option to quit ever? And I think that nowhere is that more true than stories of Everest, right? So when we think about Everest, we think, I mean, it's kind of the embodiment of grit, right? Like you have to climb 29,000 some feet in the air in order to get to the summit under really brutal conditions. You have to train for months and months and months and months and months. So this is really kind of the, the embodiment of grit. And even people who die on the mountain, by the way, are heroes like Mallory, right? So this particular story, though, like I feel like if you're going to tell a story, like there's so many stories about grit that occur on top of Mount Everest that I thought, someone should tell a story about quit as sort of the hero of the story. So this one is about 3 climbers. One is named Dr. Stewart Hutchinson, then John Taskey and Lou Kositsky. And they're part of a climbing expedition. This was in the 90s when it became very popular to climb Everest. That's when we see the book like John Krakauer's Into Thin Air, and there's a documentary called Everest and a movie called Everest actually as well. So they're part of like one of these climbing expeditions from the 90s that are so popular. And there's 8 climbers, so 8 clients really, 3 climbing Sherpas, an expedition leader, and they're going to summit Mount Everest. So they become friends during the climbs. And they get to Camp 4, and Camp 4, you're very high up, and Camp 4 is where you depart for the summit. So it's summit day, and they're gonna depart Camp 4, and you do that at midnight is when you leave. And they have a turnaround time set for the day that's been set for them by their expedition leader. And a turnaround time, like very simply put, is basically like no matter where you are on the mountain, at a particular time of day, you must turn around. So people do this for pretty much any climb that they do. And on Everest, the turnaround time for summit day is 1 p.m. And the reason that it's 1 p.m. is that, as you said, more people die on the descent, 8 times more people die on the descent than on the actual climb up to the summit. And the reason for that is that descending the mountain is quite dangerous. I mean, for one thing, it's like you're lower on oxygen, you're very tired, but also you don't want to descend in darkness. And you particularly don't want to descend Everest in darkness because there's a part of the mountain called the Southeast Ridge, which is like super narrow. And it's very easy to mess up on that part because it's so narrow. And if you do, you're either going to fall to your death into Nepal or fall to your death into Tibet, take your pick. So you want to be able to see. So one of the reasons actually that you leave base camp at midnight is to time it just right to get to the Southeast Ridge in daylight. And then you want to turn back around at 1 p.m. again to get to the Southeast Ridge in daylight.
Right.
So they know this. They know that the turnaround time is 1 p.m. And it's meant to basically keep the probability that you die low enough to make it worthwhile to summit. So they're climbing. And again, I said like these climbs started to get very popular. So they weren't the only ones trying to get up the mountain that day. There's like over 30 people trying to ascend that mountain at the same time. And a lot of that climb is single file. And so there's essentially a traffic jam. So they're going slow. So the expedition leader comes up from behind them, and Hutchinson stops the expedition leader and says, "Hey, can you tell me how long it's going to be from here until the summit?" And the expedition leader kind of looks up. They're not very far away, by the way. They're like maybe 300 feet, but that's a lot in climbing Everest time. And he says, "I think it's going to be about 3 more hours before we get to the summit." And the expedition leader scurries ahead to try to sort of get past this traffic jam and make up some time. So Hutchinson holds Taskey and Kositsky back and says, "Hey, I think we should turn around because it's almost 11:30. So by my count, if it's 3 hours to the summit, we're not gonna make it to the summit till 2:30. Like, even if somehow we made up a lot of time, like maybe we'd get there by 2. No matter what, we're not getting there at 1 o'clock, and the turnaround time is 1 p.m. And so we ought to turn around, which they did. They went back to Camp 4 and they lived. So, my point about this story is like, should be pretty clear to you why you don't know these people. Whose heroes would they be, right? Like, they were climbing, they followed the rules, they turned around, they lived, they didn't really face a lot of adversity. Doesn't really make for a good narrative, which is why nobody's ever heard of them. Except what I think is so interesting about these 3 people is most people I know have heard of them, because most people I know have either read Jon Krakauer's book Into Thin Air, seen the documentary Everest, or the movie Everest. And I think we're all pretty familiar with Rob Hall, who was the expedition leader, in fact, their expedition leader, who went up to the mountain, got there at 2 p.m., which is an hour past the turnaround time, waited up there for his client, Doug Hansen, who arrived at 4 p.m. Doug Hansen promptly collapsed and died. And by that time, Rob Hall was so exhausted and so freezing, and had no oxygen, and he died too, because he just didn't have the energy to get back down the mountain. So the question then becomes, all right, so we know that Rob Hall was certainly one of the big protagonists, and Doug Hansen, of Jon Krakauer's book Into Thin Air. So then the question is like, well, did Jon Krakauer not write about these 3 people? Because maybe that's why you don't remember who they are. And well, no, he did write about these 3 people. In fact, he said that he felt they were the best decision makers on the mountain that day. So that's not why you don't remember them. They were also in the documentary. They were also in the movie. But yeah, we have like no recollection of them at all. But think about the decision making here, right? Like, Rob Hall breaks his own turnaround time. And lest you think that he needed to wait up there for Doug Hansen, because that certainly would be a heroic act, to wait for your client so that you can help your client to try to live. He didn't need to wait up there, because remember, most of the climb is single file. So if he had gone back down, he would have caught Doug Hansen on the way down. And I made sure of that. I talked to someone who was a climbing expert, and I said, could he have climbed back down and caught Doug Hansen along the way? And the answer was yes. So, I'm not trying to vilify Rob Hall here. I mean, he was an expert analyst who I'm sure thought in the moment that he was doing the right thing. But notice that he's the hero to us. And these 3 guys, who even remembers them? Yeah. But they're the ones who made the great decision that day. Yeah.
Interesting that decision scientists might recognize people in a very different way than others. And I'll come on to free solo in a little bit, but you also talk about like Muhammad Ali as someone that we also know for, the decisions made on the way up, but the way down was clearly a lot more painful to watch.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about, again, like, the opposite of a great virtue is also a great virtue, right? Like, grit, it is 100% true that to have succeeded at something, you will have had to stick to it. That is absolutely true. But that doesn't mean if you stick to something, you'll succeed. And I think that this is where we get tripped up. So grit does show character in situations where you are persisting at something that's really difficult, perhaps even against long odds, if you think that the payoff is high enough, right? I mean, that's sort of what startup culture is. But it is not a virtue when you are doing this, when there are very clear signals that this is not something you should do anymore. Right? In the sense of, like, if it's past 1 p.m. on Everest, it's not a good idea to keep going up, right? No matter how much you want to make it to that summit and you want to persist. And I think Muhammad Ali is the embodiment of showing how in one circumstance, in one situation, grit can be a virtue, and in the other circumstance, it can be your downfall. So Muhammad Ali was born Cassius Clay, gained the heavyweight championship title. He was a boxer, gained the heavyweight championship against a guy named Sonny Liston. And in that fight, he was very much an underdog. and he ended up winning because he was a gritty guy. And he did it because his fight style was very interesting. He used to say, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. So the thing was like, he was really, really fast on his feet, very hard to hit. And so he'd be like bobbing and weaving and you couldn't hit him. And then he'd land a punch. And so he beat Sonny Liston. So soon after that, the Vietnam War starts, and he has since converted to be a Muslim, and he's changed his name to Muhammad Ali. And because of that, he refuses to be in the draft, right? So he's a conscientious objector. And the Boxing Commission then strips him of his title at the behest of the United States government. So he now can no longer fight, and he is no longer the heavyweight champion of the world. So basically, while the Vietnam War is happening, he's not allowed to fight. So once he gets his right to fight back, he starts fighting again, but it's not like they're like, oh yeah, you used to be heavyweight champion of the world, and so now we're just going to take the title away from the guy who has it now. We're going to give it to you because, like, we're just going to, we're going to make things right here. And instead, he has to fight his way back to a heavyweight title championship, which takes him about 4 years. It's a long time. You got to start at the bottom again, right? So he's, he fights, he wins, whatever. He finally gets his title shot. But by this time, he's in his 30s, which is very old for a boxer. And he's not as fast as he used to be, right? Like float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Like, it's like he's 10 years older by now. And he's got to fight a guy named George Foreman. And George Foreman was humongous and undefeated and really like never had a fight go more than a handful of rounds because he was just so big. He would just come in. It was this huge guy, just come in, he'd like punch you, he'd fall down, and his fight would be over. So Ali gets the title fight. He gets the shot, and the rumble in the jungle. And nobody thinks he's going to win because George Foreman is just considered completely unstoppable, right? And, Muhammad Ali is like much smaller than him, and he's old in comparison. So everybody thinks he's going to lose this fight. But remember, Muhammad Ali is a gritty guy, right? Like, not only did he bite, well, first of all, you have to be pretty gritty to get to be heavyweight champion of the world in the first place. But, in an underdog situation against Sonny Liston, stuck to his guns about his faith, even though it was taking his ability to box away. And then when he came back, he did the work of the 4 years of fighting in order to get the title fight. So it's clearly a lot of grit. Huge underdog in Rumble in the Jungle. And here's what he does. He comes in, he totally changes his style to what he called rope-a-dope. So he leans against the ropes and lets George Foreman pummel him. Because his theory is George Foreman's fights don't go very long. So the guy probably doesn't have a lot of stamina. So as long as he can outlast him, he should win because George Foreman's going to tire himself out, which is exactly what happened. So Foreman tires himself out. In a fight that goes the distance. Ali ends up winning the fight, and gets the heavyweight title back. But notice, look, you go take like 15 rounds of a beating from George Foreman. This probably isn't going to be that good for your body. So he's now heavyweight champion of the world, and now he's fighting. But what starts to happen is that there are signs of really bad physical decline, both physical and neurological. So Teddy Brenner, who's a very good friend of his, is the fight promoter at Madison Square Garden. And he basically says to Ali, like, I think you need to quit because he's seeing signs of neurological damage at this point. And remember, like when he says, I think you need to quit, that Teddy Brenner has a financial interest in Ali's fights because he hosts them in Madison Square Garden. So he's saying this to him at a financial disadvantage, right? But he's his friend. So he tells him, I think that you should quit. Ali's like, nope. And so Teddy Brenner quits him. Mm-hmm. Then it's maybe a week later, his fight doctor, Ferdy Pacheco, who also obviously has a financial interest in Ali continuing to fight, comes to him and says, listen, we got some x-rays and your kidneys are looking really bad. So he's really there's kidney dysfunction now occurring, which isn't surprising, right? Like he's laying against the ropes now, letting people punch him. And some of those things are kidney punches. So he says, you really need to quit because you're going to do irreparable harm.
Mm.
And Ali says, nope. And so Ferdy Pacheco quits him. Ali continues to fight past that point. It starts to become almost impossible for him to get licensed. He has a fight with Leon Spinks, which he loses in Spinks's 7th fight as a professional fighter. Larry Holmes beats him up so badly that Larry Holmes cried after the match, because Ali had been a hero of Larry Holmes. And like, it was just so devastating to Larry Holmes to have beaten this man so badly. Finally, he can't even get licensed in the United States. He ends up fighting overseas in this like debacle where they only have enough pairs of gloves for like the 2 people fighting. And so they have to like take the gloves off, put them on the next person. There's like a literal cowbell that's signaling the rounds. And we kind of know what happens after that, right? He ends up with Parkinson's syndrome, and the neurological decline was really obvious. And it's super sad because he was like really known for how sharp he was. He was so sharp-witted and he was so fast. And then you have this person who gets locked in this physical and neurological dysfunction. And who knows if he had quit when Ferdy Pacheco or Teddy Brenner had told him to, probably he wouldn't have experienced that really sharp decline. So I think that this shows you, like, look, grit can get you to where you want to go for sure. But the problem is, and also, by the way, sometimes maybe you do see something that other people don't see. I mean, nobody thought he was going to beat Sonny Liston. Nobody thought he was going to beat George Foreman. He saw it differently. So, okay. But when the world is really yelling at you, like, you got to quit, when there's objective evidence, like your kidneys are in decline, you don't see something other people don't see. And at that point, grit becomes folly. And you can see that just in this one person, right? And the interesting thing, so I happen to know that part of the story because my ex-husband was a huge boxing fan. But what's interesting is I've had so many people come up to me and say, I never knew that part of the Ali story. And I said, well, this is the problem, right? We know that he overcame very long odds to beat George Foreman, but nobody remembers that he kept fighting past that.
Yeah. No, and I'll admit to being one of those people. I didn't know the end part of that story, which is clearly.
But it's like it's not a fault on your part, right? It's what are the stories that we tell? How do we remember things? What are the things that we revere and admire?
Yeah.
Right. So if we're taking those kinds of lessons, it's no wonder, right, that this is the way that we view grit versus quit.
And I think actually, my industry is guilty of that too, right? You've got this, especially tends to be great men stories, but there's great men, great discoverers, and so forth, and therefore this drug, and you go, well, and they'll talk like loon shots, other things, talk about this kind of long, persistent sort of path towards I was always right, and here you are, here's vindication. But you talk about
but the thing you don't know is like the thousands and thousands of people who are toiling away, unwilling to quit. Yeah. Right. Those are the people that you don't hear about.
Exactly. Yeah. So his history is written by the winners.
By the winners.
Yeah, but you talk about the kind of decision science of this, and the fact that we're not omniscient, and how quitting on time can feel like quitting too early. So I want to kind of talk about some of the positives, and maybe if you give us some sort of quick insight into like Slack as a company, because I didn't know the story until you.
Well, I'll tell you the story of Stewart Butterfield. How about that? So so here's the thing about quitting. So let me just give you sort of this bind that we're in, right? So remember, I said, look, the option to start things is made under uncertainty, right? So what that means is we're going to discover all sorts of new information after the fact. And then when we discover that new information, we're really gifted with this option to quit, right? Which is really nice because, what if the first date you ever went on, like you had to stay with that person forever? Like it would make life really hard, right? But luckily you don't have to go on another date with that person. Even if you get married, you could get divorced. You don't want to do that too many times, but we do have the option when we discover that something isn't for us, that we ought to quit. The problem though is that at the time that it would be correct to quit, it's going to be like 11:30 p.m. on Everest, and you're going to have lots of oxygen, and the weather's going to be fine, and you're going to feel pretty good considering that you're 29,000 feet in the air. Because just as starting things is a forecasting problem. I'm thinking about different options. This is true for like drug development, right? Like I'm thinking about different drugs that I could develop, and I'm trying to figure out which is the best one of the things that I'm thinking about, the options that I have to invest my resources in. Which one has the highest probability of causing me to gain ground toward my goals? But obviously at the point that you start it, it's not certain that it will work, right? But then you discover new information and you can choose to go and do another option. But at the point that it would be objectively correct to quit, again, it's like it's 11:30 p.m. on Everest. You're just saying the probability of success is not high enough for me to continue. But what that means is that it's not going to be certain death at the time that you quit, right? So here's the issue that we have is that we're bad at that, right? We're bad at the beginning. We're bad at the forecasting problem at the decision to start, but we're also bad at the forecasting problem at the decision to quit. And what that means is that as we're thinking about what path is going to cause us to gain the most ground toward our goals, as we go into the future, once we've started something, basically we want to be 100% sure that the thing we're doing isn't going to work out. Otherwise, we don't want to quit it. Richard Thaler said something so insightful to me. He said, most people won't quit until it's not really a decision anymore, right? Like, so yeah, like if you get stuck in a snowstorm and you have no oxygen on the top of Everest, you have to turn around. But shouldn't you have turned around before then, right? That's the thing. So that brings me to Stewart Butterfield, who I think might be like the world's greatest quitter. So Stewart Butterfield, entrepreneur, had this dream actually since like the 90s of developing a massive multiplayer online role-playing cooperative game. So he had made one attempt sort of during the .com crash at something called Game Never Ending, and that hadn't worked out. He actually ended up spinning off a piece of it into something called Flickr. But the reason why that didn't work out was because he just couldn't get funding for it. Like during the .com crash, it was like there was no appetite for like, oh, we're going to fund a game. But he did have like a photo sharing piece of the game, which did turn into Flickr, and he sold that to Yahoo for like a modest exit. So he left Yahoo and still had this dream. So he founds a company called Tiny Speck with some of his co-founders, actually from his Flickr days. And they create a game called Glitch. And Glitch is like a critic's darling. So they called it, it was like Dr. Seuss meets Monty Python. Like it was very beautiful. And, they released the game and people start to use it, and they're having some success. So first of all, they've had a lot of fundraising success. They have $6 million in the bank raised from Andreessen Horowitz and Excel, and they've got 5,000 diehard users. And by diehard users, I mean they're using the game over 20 hours a week. So those people are obviously going to be the economic engine of the game, right? So the problem, though, as Butterfield saw it, was that they had like a user acquisition problem, because for every one person who came and used the game for 20 hours or more a week, they had, I think it was something like 95 to 99 people came and played it for 7 minutes and never came back. So, they're getting something like somewhere between 1% and 5% of the people who play actually stick. And the rest of the people are just like, yeah, it's not for me. I don't want to play. All right. So this creates an issue in terms of customer acquisition, obviously. So, they sort of realized like we don't really have a sustainable business if this is going to be the state of affairs. But up until this point, they haven't done any traditional marketing. In other words, paid advertising. They've only done word of mouth and PR, because the critics really loved the game. So they were able to get like a lot of press. So that's how they had been doing it. So now they decide, the founders, along with the investors, decide they're going to do a 6-week paid marketing push. So they do that, and it's a huge success. They grow users 6 to 7% week over week. I mean, it was like massive user growth. So now we come to this is in 2012 in the fall, and we come to the weekend of November 11th and 12th, and they've had their biggest weekend of like user acquisition yet. And Stewart Butterfield goes to bed on that Sunday night, and he's just really restless, and can't sleep. And he gets up the next morning and he writes a letter to his co-founders and his investors that says, I woke up this morning with the dead certainty that glitch was over. So that's weird, right? Like they had this hugely successful marketing push that got them tons and tons of users. So why is he now saying, we should quit? And I think this is where we see like why it's so hard to do this at the right time. So what he had done was sort of look into the future, which is really what forecasting is, right? And he said, well, look, if we keep acquiring users at the current rate, we won't be break even until 31 weeks from now.
Mm-hmm.
And it's absurd to think that we'll acquire users at the same rate, because at some point you've saturated the core gaming community. You're going to have to start going, you're going to advertise to the same people who've already seen it. So clearly the cost to acquire is going to rise. And we're not going to keep growing 6% week over week, because at some point we've gotten to all the gamers and now we're getting to like, people who have no interest in it whatsoever. So he realized like 31 weeks to break even was way too optimistic. And he sort of, did the math and he realized, okay, I don't think this is a venture scale business.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why he shut it down, because he was just thinking expected value. Like, do I think that there's enough of a chance to win at the level that we're looking to win at to make this worth continuing? And he decided no. Now, just so you know how unusual this was, this really caught his co-founders and investors by surprise.
Mm-hmm.
Because they weren't thinking in the same way. They were thinking in the it's 11:30 a.m. and I'm fine kind of way, right? Like you can kind of think about it that way, right? Like it's 11:30 a.m. I'm fine. I have lots of oxygen. Like, why do I need to turn around? That's kind of how they're thinking. And Stewart Butterfield is thinking, oh no, I'm going to get to the summit after 2 p.m. So I asked Stewart, I was like, well, so when you just explain this to them, did they like get it? Were they like, oh yes, I totally see. We should quit. He said, I don't know, that not really. Like, I think they just figured like, if I didn't want to do it, there was no point in doing it anymore. So I asked them, and then the other thing that I thought was interesting was he himself said that even so, he felt he had quit too late. Mm-hmm. Because he said, I realized that I knew 6 weeks before. I knew before we did the marketing push that we weren't going to be a venture scale business. But I didn't want to quit then because I was worried people were going to think like I had just gotten bored or capricious or whatever. So in some ways, like even for him, remember I said, Thaler said, you have to get to the point where you don't have any other choice. Yeah. Now for Butterfield, that was just way earlier than everybody else, but he realized he really should have done it 6 weeks before. And the marketing push was just sort of like to reassure him.
Yeah, evidence of the correctness of the decision. Yeah.
Right. Even though he had already known. So even for him that he considered this too late, although it was much earlier than anybody else was going to get this decision. Now, here's the interesting thing that happens though. So let me just say, this is a happy story, right? He returned $6 million to his investors. He didn't keep his employees working at something where they were getting equity mostly, and he had determined the equity wasn't worth their time. He freed up everybody to go and pursue something great. Okay. So that in itself is a happy story. I just want to say that. However, the story gets happier because one of the problems that we have, and this is why like skilling up on quitting is so important, is that when we have started something and we're engaged in a particular course of action, it causes us to be myopic and we don't really see the other things that might be available to us, right? So we stop exploring other opportunities. Like you could see this in your industry, right? Like someone's developing or pursuing research around a certain drug. Are they researching a whole bunch of other molecules as well at the exact same time? Probably not. They're working on one molecule. So you sort of lose sight of what all the other options are, what all the other opportunities are that are available to you. And this happened for Stewart Butterfield as well. Because what we find is that once you quit, you start to explore those other things. Now, all of a sudden you go, oh, wait, okay, so now I'm going to explore these other things, which he did. And within 2 days, he said, we've been using this internal communication tool at TinySpec, which everybody really loves. And it was like this way for teams to talk to each other that sort of combine the best things of like email and instant messaging, and you could like attach things. And anyway, people loved it. And they've been using it for like 2 years. But it was just this like thing that ran in the background. And in fact, it didn't even have a name. So he said, but you know what? I mean, people really like this. So maybe this should be the next product. Maybe we should develop this. So he says, okay, I should name it something. And he names it Searchable Log of All Company Knowledge. And the acronym for that is Slack. And he says to the investors, hey, I think I'm going to develop this internal communication tool. Do you want to put your money in it? And they rolled their money over into Slack, and, whatever employees he could keep, he did, because obviously they went a little bit more into startup mode again. The founders stuck around, and they sold to Salesforce for $20 billion. So here's the thing. Slack was always there. This is understand that they were using that for 2 years. The teams loved it. No, not one single person, that company thought that should be the product. Not one. Why? Because they were looking at something else. They were focused on something else. Yeah. So, I mean, this is the thing about quitting, right? Is that we think it's going to slow us down to quit. But when we quit something that is no longer worthwhile, it speeds us up because it allows us to go explore and find other things that are actually going to help us to achieve our goals more quickly.
Yeah. And you talk in the book, I mean, so it's interesting, as you then go through the chapters on psychology, right? This kind of sunk cost fallacies and escalating commitment, biases and so forth, and just this fear of changing your mind, right? Given the prevailing narrative, then you get into some of that opportunity of seeing the world as an explore and exploit model, and seeing the world as a kind of the collection of previously hidden information. If you have the room to do that, right? Which means stopping and looking around to see where you are. And I think one of the things that was elegantly expressed was this idea that you're always making a new bed, whether or not you realize you are. That could you elaborate on that kind of idea?
Okay, so yeah, there's this quirk of human psychology, which is that once we start something, we don't think about it as a decision to continue. So there's something called omission-commission bias, which is that we view the failure to act differently than acting. And when it comes to the status quo, it goes under omission. In other words, sticking with the status quo, it's sort of, we process it as just failing to switch. And so that does not feel like an active decision to us. In fact, it feels like a decision not at all. But switching is commission, an action. And so we think about that as an actual decision. So this is kind of interesting. So I'm sure you've had this happen before, where someone's talking to you and let's say they're in a relationship that they don't like, right? And they'll be talking to you and they'll be like, I'm really unhappy. I'm thinking about leaving. You're like, okay. And like, you're talking about, like, let me know what happens. And then you see them like a couple months later and you say, so like the last time I talked to you, you were like really unhappy and you were thinking about leaving. What's going on? And they'll say, well, I'm just not ready to make a decision yet. And that sounds totally fine to our ear, except why? Like, but you did make a decision. You've made a decision to stay in this relationship for 2 more months. And if you continue for 6 more months, because you're not ready to make a decision yet, you're making a decision to stay in the relationship for 6 more months. But we don't view it that way. And there's a couple of really kind of weird things that come out of that have to do with loss aversion, which is a concept from prospect theory. Daniel Kahneman won a Nobel Prize for that, based on work that he did with Amos Tversky. So loss aversion basically just says that when we're thinking about starting something, we are very focused on the losses that you might incur, right? And this comes from the idea that we process losses. Losses feel worse to us than equivalent gains feel good to us. So when we're thinking about a new project or a new job or a new relationship, or maybe switching and starting to develop like a new molecule, we're worried much more about the idea that it might fail, that we might lose, than we are thinking about what we might gain from it.
Mm.
And what this does is it causes us to make pretty bad decisions about the things that we start. First of all, it delays starting because we're so afraid of the losses. So it becomes a problem with starting new things. And we'll often choose bad things to start because we'll choose something that has a lower chance of loss associated with it, but also a lower expected value. In other words, we'll choose something that's going to cause us to gain less ground toward our goal, but it's also going to make us lose less. So like, think about like a very low probability, a low volatility investment versus one that's higher volatility, but has a higher win associated with it. All right. So, okay. So that's loss aversion. Now here's the quirk, is that we do not recruit loss aversion in the same way for things that we're already doing as we think about how the future might turn out if we stick to the status quo, than we will for new things that we're doing. Because again, loss aversion gets recruited into starting decisions, and starting decisions are sort of active decisions. So if we don't think about like the thing we're doing as an active decision to continue, we don't think so much about the possibility of loss in terms of that anymore. We're much more tolerant of the losses that we might incur from those paths in a way that we're intolerant of them for the switch. Okay, so I'll give you an example here. So I talked to this woman, Sarah Olster Martinez, who wrote me in the middle of writing this book. This was such a happenstance, right? So I think it was about halfway through the book. She actually appears much earlier in the book because I felt like it was such a great story, but I think she contacted me when I was somewhere around chapter 7. So anyway, she contacted me and she said that she was really struggling because she was in a job. She was a hospital administrator and also an ER doc. And she had been offered a new job and she was really struggling with whether she should quit her old job and switch to a new one. And so I said, oh, let's get on a Zoom. I was like, this might be interesting, right? So I said, oh, let's get on a Zoom. So anyway, I talked to her and I did, the first thing I did was just ask her what was going on in her current position. And here was the weird thing, Mike. She was miserable. Like misery. It was impinging on her family life. She was really unhappy that she had started because she had a love of emergency medicine. And then all of a sudden she's a hospital administrator and she's getting like 24/7 emails, calls, like texts, trying to solve problems. And like, she was not someone who enjoyed like bringing her work home with her. And she was just like deeply unhappy.
Yeah.
So like, I'm sure like if you were talking to her, Mike, wouldn't you have been a little confused? Like, why did this person contact me?
Yeah. Yeah.
It seems so obvious, right? Yeah. So I said to her, well, okay, let me ask you a question. Like, then how come, like, what's the problem here? Like, you have another job offer. It was with an insurance company. You have another job offer. Like, what's stopping you from taking the new job? And here's where we see this loss aversion problem and this problem with like the way that we view decisions to stick to the thing we're doing versus switch. She said, what if I take the new job and I hate that too? All right. So that's like literally loss aversion. Okay. What if I take the new thing and it doesn't work out? This is what's stopping her from doing it. But again, remember, these are expected value questions, right? Like, which path is going to help you to gain ground toward your goals? And in her case, her goal was obviously like happy, fulfilled life, good relationship with her children, so on and so forth. So now I tried to sort of switch the focus onto that and get her to think about the gains, right? So what I said to her was, okay, so imagine that it's a year from now and you've stayed in the job that you're in. And let me just say, she had been wanting to quit for a few years. So,
right.
And this is what goes on. Like, I want to quit, but maybe I won't. And then I'm not ready to make a decision yet and blah, blah, blah. And this had now been going on for years. So now I'm trying to like get her to do this, right? So I said, all right, so imagine it's a year from now. What's the probability you're happy in the job you're in? And her answer was 0%. I was like, well, why do you think it's 0? She said, well, because I've been miserable forever. So I already know. So I was like, okay, it's fair. So I said, okay, now imagine you take the new job. What's the probability you're happy in that job? She said, well, I'm not sure because I've never been in the job before. Aha, yes, decision-making under uncertainty. I said, okay, we'll take your best guess. She said, well, I guess it would be like 50-50. So I said, well, Sarah, is 50% greater than 0? And it was like this immediate light bulb, right? Like, oh my gosh, It is.
Hmm.
And she quit that week.
Mm-hmm.
And last I heard from her, she's incredibly happy or
Yeah.
happier.
Yeah.
And I think that this shows this problem with, we don't view staying the course as an active decision, because if you look at the losses that were associated with the course she was already on, they were huge compared to the potential losses from the course that she was considering switching to. And yet she wouldn't switch because loss aversion makes it hard for us to switch, because we're so worried about the downside.
Yeah. And I want to roll that forward into, conversation about what might happen, right? So the innovation world is full of things that have never happened before, so we don't necessarily know how they're going to turn out, and draw it back to that conversation about goals, right? Because I think, in the book you rightly address, well, let's craft meaningful goals instead of the slightly myopic ones that we otherwise would have. And one of the early guests on this podcast a few years ago worked at X, and you had a great explanation about the kind of loss cutting strategy at X, and how they begin to think about things in general. And I love the fact that you're going to reintroduce now the idea of monkeys and pedestals. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So just as background, we need to understand really one of the main forces that stops us from quitting, and that force is sunk cost.
Mm-hmm.
So sunk cost is that we take into account what we've already invested in a course of action in deciding whether we should continue. Now, like on the face of it, maybe that doesn't sound that irrational, but it is. So let me explain why. When we're thinking about the starting decision, we're sort of just looking at the option and saying, what path do I think is going to be the best path for me to take, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really how we should make decisions, right? Is from here forward, if I think about the investment that I'm going to have to make, is it worthwhile for me to invest in this? So we could think about like a stock, right? Like you're approaching a stock and you're thinking about, do I think that this stock is priced in a way where if I invest in it, I'm going to be making money on any dollar that I put into the stock? Okay, so that's the way that we're supposed to think about decisions. But what happens with sunk cost is that we take into account what we've already sunk into it.
Mm-hmm.
So what that means is that we will think differently about buying a stock at 40 than we will think about that exact same stock if we bought it at 50 and it's now trading at 40. So if we're just thinking about fresh decision, buying the stock at 40, we'll be pretty rational about that. But and so let's say that we look at that and we say, yeah, it's not really something that I would buy right now. I think there's better stocks out there for me. But if we bought it at 50 and it's now trading at 40, notice we're carrying a loss now we'll continue to hold it. Mm. Holding being the same as buying, right? Mm. So we'll continue to hold it. And you've heard things like this, like, I want to get my money back. I need to protect the money I already have invested. One of the big things that people say is, but I don't want to have wasted something. So in the case of a job, right, like you're in a job that you hate, and actually Sarah Olsten Martinez said this to me, but I don't want to have wasted all the training that I put into the job. I've spent I've been in this job for 15 years. I've put so much into it. I went through medical school. I did my residency. I don't want to have wasted all of that. The problem with that is that we're thinking there of waste as a backward-looking problem, not a forward-looking one. Like if you're working on a molecule and all signs point to this isn't going to do what you need it to do, you shouldn't continue just because you feel like you'll have wasted all the effort that you already put into it and all the money that you put into that development. If you came to that fresh and you saw all the data so far and you determined it wasn't worthwhile, then you shouldn't continue regardless of whether you have something in it, because waste is not a backward looking problem. It's a forward looking problem. You don't want to waste more going forward in service of worry about retrospective waste. Okay. So the reason why I need to set that up is because when we think about when we think about starting something, we need to be sensitive to this. Mm-hmm. Not just sunk cost, but also like ownership over ideas can stop us from stopping things. How our identity gets wrapped up into stuff can stop us from stopping things. So there's this like cognitive debris that builds up, the biggest of which is sunk cost, as we start to engage in something. right? As we start to develop something, we start a project, we're developing a product, we own a stock, whatever, we start to build up this cognitive debris that goes along with it. So if we're going to approach, how do we approach problems? How do we approach project planning? How do we approach product management? Then what we want to do is to think about how can we reduce that debris as we go into something. And this is particularly important for things that are innovative. Because when we start something where we're being innovative, by definition, it means that we are going to discover a lot more information after the fact than we knew before we started it, by definition, right? And what we want to do is make sure that we're not in a situation where now, because we have invested time and energy and attention and whatnot, maybe part of our identity is wrapped up to it, that just because we've now started to invest in stuff, that when we start to get that bad news, that we won't stop, that we start to escalate our commitment to those causes, which is what we find. All right. So how can we do this? How can we actually be sensitive when we're coming into, how are we planning this project, right? How are we thinking about developing this product, that we can now actually get into the planning process, the reduction of this debris, so that we can be more rational when we see those signals. And this brings us to monkeys and pedestals. So I know that was a little roundabout, but I love the way you came at it. Yeah. I just wanted to set that up. Okay. So monkeys and pedestals. So monkeys and pedestals is a mental model from Astro Teller, who is the CEO, otherwise known as Captain of Moonshots, at X, which is Google's in-house innovation hub. All right. So he's thinking again in like the moonshot space, right? Like he knows that he's going to be starting things when he doesn't know a whole lot about them. And he's very sensitive to the fact that even Google has limited resources. And he wants to make sure that they're attending to things that are the most worthwhile. In other words, in his case, the most likely to actually fulfill the charter of Google, of X rather, which is 10x better in 5 to 10 years commercialization. Right. So they have a very specific idea, and they're in the tech space. So the idea is that if they can do it before 5 years, someone's probably already doing it. If it takes them longer than 10 years, probably by the time they figure it out, it'll be obsolete. So that's the idea.
Yeah, and I love, and because I know we won't have unlimited time, but I love the way that you pulled out the kind of state and date nature of that, because I don't think people do know that about them, right?
Right. Yeah. So this is really important also, and we can get to that in a second, but notice that the charter itself is very clear about what the deadline is, right? So I already referred to it a little bit when I said like Sarah Ulster Martinez, like she was unhappy, but then it was like, but maybe things will turn around. And then she was unhappy, and then maybe things will turn around, and I'm not ready to decide, and all of this. And all of a sudden it had gone on for like 3 years like this. So we really want to set deadlines. And that's what they're doing. It has to happen within 5 to 10 years. And we can talk about that further, but it's really nicely built into their charter. So they're now going to say that I'm going to get pitched a bunch of projects. And we know that we want to fulfill the charter. And we know that we're going to be doing this when we have very little information. And we want to make sure that when we get the information that we ought to quit, that we do it fast. Because if we can quit something after spending $2 million on it, when we would have otherwise spent $9 million on it, win for us. It's not a, notice again, this idea of waste. It's not a waste of $2 million. It's a savings. We prevented ourselves from wasting $7 million.
Right.
So he does this with this. So he applies this mental model, monkeys and pedestals, to anything that gets pitched, and all of the projects that they're doing over there. So it goes like this. Imagine that you're trying to train a monkey to juggle flaming torches while standing on a pedestal in the town square. If you're going to approach this money-making scheme, what should you do first? Should you build a pedestal that the monkey is going to stand on? Or should you see if you can train that monkey to juggle the flaming torches? And the answer is juggle, the juggling. Make sure that monkey can juggle. So let's think about why that is. There's 3 main reasons why you would want to make sure that that's the thing that you're doing first. The number one is that there's no point in building the pedestal if you can't train the monkey to juggle the flaming torches. It's the thing that's going to unlock the system for you. And if you can't do that, and it is the greatest unknown, right? If you can't do that, there's no point, literally no point in building the pedestal. Right. So that's kind of reason number one, is that why build the pedestal, right? Reason number 2 has to do with really what's the unknown, what's the information that you're trying to unlock. So if you go to build the pedestal first, it feels like progress, right? Because you're producing something. It feels like progress, but it's actually no progress at all. It's just the illusion of progress, because have you learned anything?
Mm.
No. Like, you already know you can build a pedestal.
Mm.
In a pinch, I can turn a milk crate upside down and put a little velvet thing over it, right? Like, we already know that we can build the pedestal. So if you start with building the pedestal, which is not the unknown, it's false progress. You haven't actually learned anything.
Mm.
And what happens with false progress? This comes to the third piece, is that you're now starting to accumulate sunk cost. And if you build those pedestals, you have now put time and energy, attention to something that isn't actually creating any progress, which there's no point to anyway, because you don't know about the monkey yet. And what will happen is that sunk cost, when you actually start to go to try to train the monkey and it turns out it isn't going well, is going to create friction for you to actually shut the thing down when you discover that you can't get that monkey to juggle. So one of my favorite recent examples, I refer to this very briefly in the book, but there's new information now, so I'm very excited about it. So one of my favorite examples of the way that he applies monkeys and pedestals, and with everything, he says, what's the monkey? Hashtag monkey first. Like, this is the language that they use over there. They were pitched the Hyperloop. Are you familiar with the Hyperloop?
So yes, and I'm going to ask you to, because the example in the book I felt was written with passion, the California bullet train, which I felt was a sort of almost adversary in the book. But yeah.
Well, no, okay. Well, I'll do the California bullet train.
No, I think let's do Hyperloop first, because I think it's a really good illustration.
So here's the thing. So they got pitched the Hyperloop.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is like such a great demonstration of the power of monkeys and pedestals. So they get pitched the Hyperloop. Hyperloop is just like trying to get people from New York to LA in like 2.5 hours, like basically sucking a train through a vacuum tube. All right. So they get pitched. And now the team at X does a monkeys and pedestals exercise. So they say, well, okay, so what are the monkeys here? So the first one is the technology there. And it turned out that had already been solved. So they knew that they could actually get the train to go through a vacuum tube. Okay, so they had solved that problem already. That's part of why it was being pitched to them, because the technology was there. So they said, well, what are the other monkeys? And they came up with 2. The first monkey was a regulatory issue. That you have to go through a lot of different townships, and it's like there's right-of-way issues and maybe eminent domain and like just a whole bunch of stuff. It's like it's a nightmare to try to sort of figure out like how would you actually be able to solve for all of this to get the train from one end of the country to the other. And as he said, like, we're Peter Pans with PhDs. Like, I don't know if that's a monkey that we can solve. But the more significant monkey was that they did not know, if you have a train going that fast, if you could stop it without killing everybody on board.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like a pretty big monkey.
Mm-hmm.
So they started to say, okay, so like, how would we actually tackle this monkey? So they started kind of sort of figuring out, like mathing out, like, so how much of the actual system would we have to build? Now, they considered the system to be a pedestal. Remember, they knew they could, at this point, they already know that they can build it. So they know they can build the Hyperloop. So any building of actual sections of the system is going to be a pedestal. Now, you can build pedestals if they're helping you to solve the monkey, right? So they're now trying to figure out like how big a pedestal do we need to build in order to solve the monkey. And what they figured out was, in order to get the train up to full speed, they'd have to essentially build the whole thing. So they said, well, this isn't for us, because we don't like projects like that. We don't like projects where if they fail, we haven't learned anything new that's of use to us, right? Because knowing that we can build the system isn't particularly helpful to us if you can't actually transport people on it. So they now reject it in 15 minutes. All right, so that's how much they spent on it, was 15 minutes. Virgin ended up going for it, and they've raised, I think, like $160 million. And there was just a big article in the New York Times that they've run into a lot of problems. And can you guess what the 2 big problems are that they're having?
Yeah.
So they can't solve the regulatory problem, and they've only managed to get the thing up to a sixth of the speed, which they sort of like halfway consider a safety test. So now it's really come into these roadblocks. The exact same monkeys that AstroTeller understood, they spent tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars to find out what AstroTeller learned in 15 minutes. And now, just as he predicted, this is the monkeys and pedestals problem. Are they quitting? No. Instead, they're saying, well, we're not actually going to transport people. We'll transport cargo instead.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to spend all this money to build a big system to solve a problem that we don't have.
Right.
Because they've already built this huge pedestal. They've put too much into it to quit now. So I feel like that's just such a good example of like the power of monkeys and pedestals.
Yeah, and now they're going to start convincing everyone that they really want pedestals with no monkeys. It's
Right.
that's part of the challenge. Yeah. So I'm aware that we won't have unlimited time, and people should be reading the book. But one of the things that you talk about is in the book is, I'm going to simplify this into sort of kill criteria, and maybe the idea of having a coach, someone who loves you to tell you to stop. Would those be sort of two of the big things that you take out of this?
Yeah, I would say so. So monkeys and pedestals is helping you to identify what the challenges might be in advance, right? So, for the Hyperloop, it's this problem of, are you going to kill everybody on board? For the California Bullet Train, which is high-speed rail from San Francisco to LA to connect those two areas, any pedestals would be building on flat land in the Central Valley, because you already know you can build sections of rail there. The monkeys are, can you blast through two mountain ranges in an area that is seismically active?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the California Bullet Train has thus far spent $9 billion building on flat land, has done nothing about whether you can tackle the mountains. And the budget has gone from 33 billion to 105 billion in the process. So that's another good example of monkeys and pedestals, but it also shows you how you might think about kill criteria, right? So if you were approach the project planning saying, what are the monkeys as opposed to what are the pedestals, you would immediately say, we need to do an engineering feasibility study on the mountains. That seems pretty clear, right? Which is not what they did at all. Right. Do you know why? Actually, so when people do project planning, it happens in every project planning meeting. What's the low hanging fruit? Right. That's what everybody says. And then they're like, let's go do that. Right. Well, low hanging fruit or pedestals. They did this with the California. What's the part of how can we get started? Basically is what they were saying. Right. Like, how can we start building track? It's like, well, we'll do it in the Central Valley because we know that we can. And that's how you sort of get stuck and stuff. But what we want to do, besides like this idea of like, how do we come in and plan our approach, is to also, to the point of like, in 5 to 10 years commercialization, say, what's the goal, right? How long are we going to continue to do this? And then what are the signals that we could see that would tell us that we ought to stop? So we do this through something called kill criteria. So we want to do monkeys and pedestals in terms of planning the order in which we do things. And then we also want to do kill criteria, which is, what are the signals that are going to tell us that we're not actually going to be able to do this, or that things aren't going our way in comparison to other things. So if we were to take the California Bullet Train, it's like, we're going to do an engineering feasibility study. So that would be the monkey. And then what could we find out in that feasibility study that would tell us that we ought not to continue? Right? So you're basically writing that stuff down in advance. Very simple example of a kill criteria, a turnaround time on Everest. That's a kill criteria. If at 1 p.m. you're not where you need to go, you got to turn around, period. Right? So that's like the simplest example of a kill criteria. So I actually did like a kill criteria exercise with a group of sellers. Sellers being very gritty people who live to close the deal. But like everything else with selling, you have a bunch of stuff that's at the top of your funnel, and you want to qualify things out really early and then stick to the stuff that really is worthwhile. Right. So we always want to have this kind of like barbell distribution in our lives, right? Like, stop doing the stuff that isn't working as quickly as possible, and then really stick to the stuff, no matter how hard. Stick to the stuff that is worthwhile and worth continuing. You have a bunch of molecules at the top of the funnel, right? You're thinking, these are going to help me to solve this particular problem. Here are all the candidate molecules, right? And then you want to sample them and quit the ones that you think are not promising as fast as possible so that you can really concentrate on the ones that you think will really actually solve the problem. So this is how we're trying to do everything. And that's true of selling as well. The problem with this group of sellers was that they just stuck to stuff, partly because of leadership, right? Because leadership evaluates people for sticking to things. Right? Like, did you reach the goal? Did you close the deal? If you didn't, you have to defend yourself. Why didn't you close it? Right? So this creates this behavior where sellers just stick to stuff. So we wanted to sort of undo that and get them to have this more barbell type of distribution. So I sent out a prompt to them that said, imagine that you were pursuing a lead and it's 6 months later and the lead is lost. You didn't win it. Looking back, you realize there were early signals that you weren't going to win the lead. And they said things that you would expect. So this was a software company and they said, well, they have a competitor installed. They only wanted to talk about price. Right. That kind of thing. So now, and what was interesting was I had seen many of the sellers continue to pursue leads where they had a competitor installed. I had seen them continue to pursue leads where the only thing they wanted to talk about was price, even though these were such negative signals, because they always feel like, well, I can win and I got to try. And what are you going to get rewarded for? The trying, the not letting go, the grit. That's what you're going to get rewarded for, even though you shouldn't. So they created this list of kill criteria. Some of them were things where you would kill right away. If you found out they had a competitor installed, you would just kill it. If it was something like we couldn't get an executive in the room, you would then say, listen, we find that deals go better if we have executive alignment. We'll bring in an executive from our side. You bring in an executive from your side. Let's do that at the next meeting. And if they said no to that, then they would kill it. So now we have this whole set of kill criteria. And what happens now is that gets put into deal review. So every week when the sellers are going with leadership through the deals that they're pursuing, they're checking on these kill criteria and they're saying, hey, do they have a competitor installed? And if the seller says yes, leadership now says, well, then why are you still pursuing it? So notice that we've now sort of flipped the script, right? Where they're getting rewarded for pursuing the deals that matter and really being gritty and sticking to those. But also, if they don't quit the things where it's clear that they should, they are not getting good marks for that now, which they were before. And now it's just like kudos, like, oh, you qualified this out early. That's amazing. And that has now become part of the culture, is this idea of this balance between grit and quit through the use of kill criteria. Now, as you alluded to, the best kill criteria have both a state and a date. So you want to have a deadline associated with it. The deadline could be something to do with like how much money you've spent. That could create a deadline. It could be a date, right? That could create a deadline. So like if you're in a job that you don't like, you can say, how long am I okay with the status quo? Let's say you say, I'm good with it for another 3 months. Okay, what could I see in 3 months that would tell me that this is not the job for me? Okay, I'm going to write that list of things down. And then you should accompany that with some input questions, right? Like, as an example, so what would I have to do to create a better version of the future for me? Like maybe you have to have a sit down with your boss, maybe you get yourself a coach, whatever it is. So you figure that out. But then when you see that your boss is indeed still toxic, you would leave. Now, in terms of like another way to set a deadline, I'm really unhappy, but I don't think I have the option to leave my job until I have 6 months worth of runway. So that would then create the deadline, is when I have 6 months worth of runway, then I will assess what the state is that I am in, and I will have decided in advance what that state is.
Yeah, so I kind of like, I mean, it's essentially you conducted a pre-mortem with these sellers. It's a deeply uncomfortable thing to do. I mean, we've tried to do it with some teams, but they don't really want to confront the possibility of failure or what the reasons might be. In that role, are you acting as that kind of like, kind coach, the quitting coach?
Yeah. So, I think, look, the reason why you want to do kill criteria, so this is, people have said this to me, like, well, I don't understand, like, why do I need to write the kill criteria down? Because if my boss is toxic, like, aren't I going to know that when I see it? Right? If the prospective client has a competitor installed, like, won't I know that? Right? If my clinical trial fails, like, aren't I going to know that at the time? And the answer is yes, you will see it, but when you're already in it, having accumulated all of the sunk costs and your identity is wrapped up in that, and you're worried about how other people are going to judge you, and you sort of have ownership over these ideas and so on and so forth, it's going to be really, you're going to do a really good job at rationalizing away those signals and doubling down on your commitment that it will work out. So when you do this in advance, this kind of pre-commitment, it just it helps you to act more rationally, more like you were approaching the decision fresh, because you're deciding about it at a time when you're not actually facing the decision down. Now, another way to do that, to kind of like get outside of the decision, is to find someone who is actually outside of the decision. So if I'm talking to you about whether I should stay in a job or continue to pursue a project or continue to develop a product, you don't have the sunk costs, right? Like, you haven't accumulated all of that debris, so you can see it much more clearly than I can. And so if I can get your help, that's going to actually help me to be a better quitter. Now, presumably leadership should be acting in this role, right? So they should be good quitting coaches. So but you have to know that this is something that you have to coach toward. So sales leadership at this company was really evaluating toward the closing of the deal. Now, if they're doing that, they're not acting as effective quitting coaches. But by setting the kill criteria, including that as part of deal review, now leadership can also act as a quitting coach. In other words, like, I'm going to help you to go through this stuff and figure out when you should qualify something out really early. And that now is going to increase the chances that the sellers are actually going to do this, and they're going to stop spending their time on deals that are not worth pursuing, right? A therapist can be a quitting coach. Right? Because they can help to sort of see, like, when your relationship isn't good and you really ought to get out of it. They can help you set deadlines. They can help you figure out what the inputs are. If I'm thinking about quitting my job, it's good for me to go talk to a mentor and ask things like, is my unhappiness realistic? So as an example, let's say I want to quit my job because I'm in an entry-level position and I don't understand why haven't been promoted yet. A mentor can help me to see that that's unrealistic, right? But let's say that my gripes really are realistic. The mentor can help me to see what's a reasonable amount of time within which maybe I could turn it around. What would be the signals that would tell me that I ought not to stay? What are the benchmarks that I could hit that would tell me that I should? And then help me figure out what the inputs are. What are the things that you might do to help to make this better? And they can help me sort of work through all of that stuff, set those kill criteria, and then hold me accountable. This is the key. Hold me accountable to the kill criteria that we have set.
I like that framing of, leadership is often part of the certainty seeking team, right? We're
Yes.
all moving towards, and all I'm asking you about is, are you on the milestones towards progress, rather than what else you might be doing with your time?
Well, yeah, I mean, and you could look at think about it from a leadership perspective, right? Like, when do we do postmortems? Right? When something hasn't worked. So if that's the case, people are going to be afraid of shutting projects down, because when you shut it down, that's the moment that you're going to have to do a postmortem. And no matter how much we say, like, that it's an after action review, or like it's a blameless postmortem, or any of those things that we try to do, someone's defending themselves. Like, why did you start it? What were the mistakes you made along the way? And honestly, embedded in that is, why did you fail? Even if someone's saying we celebrate failure around here, and I'm like, stop saying that, because quitting is a success. Wait, that's AstroTeller's insight. If I quit after 2 million instead of 9 million, that is a success. I did not fail at something. I succeeded at something, because I stopped myself from doing something that isn't worthwhile. So you have to also train leadership to be good quitting coaches, to understand that when you're setting these kill criteria in advance, like, if you're pursuing development of a particular drug, right? And you say, okay, what are the milestones that we need to hit? What are the things that, if we start to see this, these signals occurring, then we need to either shut it down, or kill criteria can trigger the seeking of new information. As in the case of, there's no decision maker in the room and we've had 3 meetings. Right. So now that triggers, I'm going to offer executive alignment at the next meeting. Then if that's negative, I'll quit, right? So it might seek the seeking of new information. But when you actually set that out, and you can do this on a regular cadence, right? Then what happens is that leadership can start to act as a quitting coach, right? Then they're not exacerbating the problem. So when you enter into a project, you can set kill criteria. Then, you can do quarterly reviews and say, okay, what might we see in the next quarter that would tell us that we ought to stop, that this isn't the right thing to pursue? If, and you can keep continually be doing this so that you have these exit criteria available to you that helps everybody to be better in these decisions.
Yeah, and that framing of, I keep pushing back against this language in our industry of using early stage studies as things that you can succeed or fail at, right? So that study failed. You go, well, it was only set up to tell you one thing, as you say. It's one pedestal, and if it succeeded, it doesn't tell you anything. If it failed, they might have taught you something different.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to find out, like, okay, right. I've got to do the study, but it's in order to answer a monkey, right? Like I'm trying to answer a monkey here, and if I get a bad answer, great. Yeah. That was a big savings of time. I mean, I started it without knowing very much. I found out as quickly as possible the information that I needed to know. Why did that fail? That study didn't fail, it succeeded.
Yeah.
And exactly what its purpose was.
Yeah. So where I need to let you get to other stuff. And I was right about the California bullet train, right? There was some passion in that chapter, as well as the...
Oh my gosh. Completely. Like, that's why I'm so like I've got this new Hyperloop example, but it's such a good example. It's just like, oh my gosh, are you kidding me?
Yeah. We've got one in the UK. It's called High Speed 2, the railway. That just because they're in it now, they go, oh, this would be a waste of the money that we spent.
Money, right? Like, exactly. Public, we don't want to waste the public fund. It's like, okay, well, you've spent $9 billion, but by my math, you're planning to spend $100 billion more, and you have no idea if you can not trigger an earthquake and trying to go through these mountains. Good luck with that.
I don't think we have that issue, but certainly it's the value of building it is an unknown.
I saw with the California bullet train, I saw one of the most amazing things. So there was just a big article about the California bullet train, and as I said, they made this decision to build on flat land first. And they've actually approved 3 sections of track, all of which are on flat land. So none of it is addressing the mountains. And just to set the stage, there's a mountain range to the north of LA, and there's a big mountain range to the south of San Francisco. So there's no way to connect the two without dealing with these monkeys, right? You've got to deal with these mountains. So there was just an article about this. And then I saw on Twitter, this person really defended it by saying, well, of course we started on flat land because it was easier and we knew we could do it. And this was like this is a real person saying this. And this is how people think about it, right? Well, of course we started there because we knew we could do it. It was easier. It's like, what a waste of money, right? Because you don't know if you can get the train to go from anywhere to anywhere if you do that. So
we see that with Alzheimer's studies and a whole bunch of things that people do the easy thing, and they call it progress and they call it success, and then
but it's not progress, right? Like, that's the thing. It's like, that's what people have to remember, is it's not progress. You have to, there's a scientific word which it's a concept that people can look up, which is called reverse salient. That's really what a monkey is. So monkeys and pedestals is easier to remember, but a reverse salient is what we would think about, which is what's the thing that we don't know that could unlock the whole system. So a good example of a reverse salient is there's all sorts of things you could do in service of building electric vehicles. But if you don't have the battery problem solved, none of the other stuff matters, right? So you have to solve the battery issue before any of the other stuff, before you can unlock the whole system, right? So there's no reason to build a network of charging stations. There's no reason to build any part of the car itself. There's none of that, because none of it matters unless you have the battery problem solved, right? So that's an example of a reverse salient. It was initially, I think, introduced in terms of thinking about electricity, right? Like, which is like the generation of the power. Before you solve for the distribution, right? Like that kind of thing. So it's actually a very powerful concept. Saying a monkey is easier than reverse salient, and I think it's more memorable.
Yeah, absolutely. you're always memorable, Annie. So I feel like I should be inviting you back in another year or two when the next book is out. Are you
I've
working on
got
anything?
there's a little something brewing in my head, but I don't know. I'm thinking about it. I'm not promising anything, but I got something in my head.
I'm not surprised at all. This has been hugely enjoyable. Just remind us how folks can find you and more information about.
Yeah,
your
the
work.
easiest way is just to go to annieduke.com. You find all my social there. You can figure out how to buy my books from there. You can figure out how to contact me from there. You can find my newsletter there. There's a bunch of video of me talking there. All my podcasts are listed there. So that's kind of like a one-stop shop. And then I also hope that people will go visit the Alliance for Decision Education, which is a nonprofit that I co-founded. And we're trying to bring decision education to every K through 12 classroom, because we figure the most important thing right now for kids is to be able to figure out what's true and what to do. Yeah. And we don't do a lot of that in school. We teach them trigonometry instead. So
yeah. And critical thinking and decision science seems like the future for a lot of this, right? Annie,
well, we think so. We're trying to do what we can about it.
Yeah. I knew this would be fun, but even more fun than I expected. So thank you, Annie.
Thank you. This was so fun. I'm happy you had me back. I feel so honored. Thank you for giving me a platform to be able to talk about the crazy stuff that happens in my head. I'm really appreciative of that. Thank you.
Always. Thank you so much.
That's it for this week's episode of Idea Collider. To continue the conversation, visit our website at ideapharma.com. Follow us in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcast. Until next time, I'm Mike Rea, wishing you great success.